The dinner table that night was set for 14 people. I remember that detail because I had helped set it. I had folded the napkins myself, those stiff ivory linen ones his mother kept in a cedar drawer and only brought out when she wanted to remind everyone that she had standards. I had driven 40 minutes to pick up the rosemary focaccia from the bakery on Westheimer because Marcus had asked me to specifically. That morning I had smiled at every person who walked through that door. I had refilled glasses. I had laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I had done everything right. And still at 8:47 on a Saturday evening in October, in front of his mother, his sister, 2 of his uncles, 3 cousins, and a handful of people I had cooked for and smiled at for 6 years, my husband's hand connected with my left cheek hard enough to make the wine glasses rattle. The sound was flat, sharp, unmistakable. And then the room went completely, perfectly silent. I didn't fall. I didn't scream. I stood very still and felt the heat rise up through my jaw and spread across my face like spilled water. I looked around that table, 14 people, and not one of them moved. His mother picked up her fork. His sister looked down at her plate. One of the uncles cleared his throat and reached for his drink. 14 people. And the silence said everything their mouths refused to. That should have been the moment I broke. It wasn't. Because from the far corner of the dining room near the doorway that led to the back hall, I heard the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair being pushed back. And a man stood up. A man with gray at his temples and a stillness about him that I recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard since childhood. My father Raymond, a man I had not seen in 20 years, walked across that room, placed himself between me and my husband, and said 4 words in a voice so quiet it somehow filled every corner of that house. That will not continue. Nobody moved. Not even Marcus. And I remember thinking, not why are you here, but how did you know? My name is Serena. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my adult life I have been the kind of person that people describe as capable. I run a small occupational therapy practice in the Midtown area of Houston, 4 therapists on staff, a client waitlist that runs about 6 weeks long, and a lease I signed with my own credit in 2019. I built that practice from a sublease arrangement in another clinic's back office, working evenings and Saturdays for 2 years before I could afford my own space. I say that not to impress you, but because it matters to the story. It matters because the woman who stood at that dinner table was not fragile. She was not naive. She was not someone who didn't see the signs. She was someone who had spent 6 years being convinced that what she saw wasn't real. I married Marcus when I was 28. He was charming in the specific way that competent people can be charming, organized, articulate, always had a plan. He came from a family with money, or at least the performance of it. His mother, Patricia, ran the household like a small corporation, and Marcus was her most valuable asset. Everything in that family flowed through Patricia's approval. Her opinion was currency. And from the very beginning, I was made to understand that I was tolerated. Not welcomed. Tolerated. Marcus and I had no children. That was something we had discussed early and agreed on, or so I believed. By year 3 of the marriage, it had become something he used against me in arguments. You never wanted a real family anyway. As if a decision we made together had quietly been rewritten as my personal failing. I contributed $4,200 a month to our joint household. I managed my own business. I maintained the home. I attended every family event, every holiday dinner, every birthday party for cousins I barely knew. And I was still somehow never quite enough. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly watching. Filing things away. The way that you do when some part of you, some calm and careful part, already knows that a day of reckoning is coming even before you're ready to admit it to yourself. Let me tell you about the 3 moments that I return to now, the ones that, looking back, were never isolated incidents. They were a system. The first was the joint account. 14 months into our marriage, Marcus suggested we consolidate our finances into a shared account for household expenses. Reasonable enough. I moved $18,000 of my savings into that account as an initial contribution, my share of a home renovation we had planned together. Within 6 weeks, the renovation budget had been quietly redirected. Marcus had used $11,000 of it to invest in a logistics venture with his cousin Derek without telling me, without asking, without so much as a mention over dinner. When I found the transfer statement and asked about it, he looked at me with this particular expression he had, patient, slightly disappointed, like I was a child misreading a situation, and said, I didn't think you'd understand the opportunity. I was a business owner. I read financial statements for fun. The second moment was Thanksgiving 2 years later. I had cooked for 11 people that year. Fully. Turkey, 3 sides, 2 pies. The cornbread dressing that Patricia had specifically requested. I had started at 6 a.m. and was still standing at the kitchen counter at 4 in the afternoon when the family sat down. Patricia said grace, thanked God, thanked Marcus for putting together such a beautiful gathering, and not a single person at that table said my name. Not one. Marcus smiled and accepted it. He didn't correct her. He looked right at me when she said it and he smiled. The third moment was the business loan and 2022. Marcus wanted to expand a consulting side project into a full LLC. He needed a co-signer on a $60,000 SBA loan because his personal credit had taken a hit from the logistics venture Derek's venture, the one bought with my $11,000 I co-signed. My credit profile, my professional history, my signature on the documents. The loan was approved within 3 weeks. The launch dinner for his new company, a dinner that Patricia organized, that his sister decorated for, that 12 people attended. I sat at the far end of the table and listened to Marcus give a toast about doing this on his own. I raised my glass with everyone else. That was the version of me that walked into that October dinner party. But that was also the last night that version of me existed. Because Raymond was in that room. And Raymond, I was about to learn, had not come back empty-handed. Let me take you back to that October evening properly. Because what I gave you before was just the outline. The real story has texture, and you deserve to feel every thread of it. The dinner had been called by Patricia. That alone should have been a signal. Patricia didn't call family gatherings to celebrate people. She called them to consolidate power. Every major announcement in that family, every decision, every realignment of loyalty, happened at her dining table, under her chandelier, with her ivory napkins folded into triangles on everyone's lap. Marcus had told me it was a simple family dinner. Nothing special, Serena. Just show up and be pleasant. That phrase, be pleasant, was one he used with a specific frequency. It was never about the event. It was always a reminder. Calibration. A way of saying, your job tonight is to be decorative and agreeable, so don't embarrass me. I wore a burgundy dress. I had my hair pinned up. I brought a bottle of Bordeaux that cost $72 because I knew Patricia judged wine labels the way other people judged character. Dinner started well enough, if you define well as successfully performing warmth for 2 hours while a family that barely acknowledged your existence helped themselves to the food you'd partially contributed to buying. By the time the main course was cleared, I noticed Marcus had been drinking more than usual. His second scotch arrived before the salad plates were taken away. His third came with the entree. Noticed. Always noticed. I had learned to read the barometric pressure of his moods the way sailors read the sky. Not out of affection but out of survival. It was during the dessert course that Patricia made her announcement. She stood at the head of the table. And I want you to picture this woman in her cream blazer and pearl earrings, perfectly composed. And she announced that she had decided to transfer the family's primary real estate asset, a commercial property on the southwest side worth somewhere north of $800,000, into Marcus's name alone. Not a joint family trust. Not split among her children. Marcus, loan. There was polite applause from the cousins. His sister Diane smiled the tight smile of someone who had already been told and had already made her peace with it. And then Patricia looked directly at me and said, with a sweetness that was perfectly engineered, "Of course, we want to make sure it stays in the family bloodline." Table heard it. Every single person at that table heard exactly what she meant. I felt the color rise in my face. I set my fork down very carefully. I was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds I made the mistake of letting Marcus see that it had landed. That it had hurt. That I was human. That was all he needed. He turned to me with that patient, disappointed expression and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Don't make this about you, Serena. This is a family matter." I said quietly, "I am his wife. I am family." And he said, and I will remember this sentence for the rest of my life, "You're a guest in this family. You've always been a guest." Act like one. I stood up. I don't know exactly what I was going to do. Walk away maybe. Excuse myself. Preserve what was left of my dignity by removing it from the room before it could be further dismantled. But Marcus stood up too. Faster than I expected. And his hand came across my cheek before I had fully processed that he was moving. Sound. I've tried to describe it to my therapist 3 times and I still can't get it right. It wasn't loud the way you'd expect. It was efficient. Like a period at the end of a sentence he'd been writing for 6 years. And then the silence. 14 people. Every napkins. A chandelier throwing warm light over a scene that no one was willing to name. Until Raymond stood up. I hadn't even registered him properly when I arrived. He was seated near the back, introduced to me only as a family friend of your father's side by Marcus, who clearly had not expected him to be recognized. I had glanced at him across the room and felt something strange. A familiarity I couldn't place, the way you can't place a smell until suddenly you can, and then it hits you all at once. He crossed the room in 8 steps. He placed himself between me and Marcus with the quiet certainty of someone who has been waiting for the right moment for a very long time. That will not continue, he said. Marcus stared at him. Who are you? Raymond looked at him the way you look at something small that has briefly inconvenienced you. I'm her father. The room shifted. Patricia's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. Diane looked up from her plate for the first time all evening. Marcus blinked. Actually blinked like the word hadn't computed. Raymond didn't wait for a response. He turned to me, held out his hand and said simply, "Come with me." Picked up my clutch. I walked out of that dining room, past 14 silent people, past the ivory napkins and the $72 Bordeaux and the chandelier and the cream blazer and 20 years of being told I was a guest. In the car before he started the engine, Raymond turned to me and said, "I need to show you something. But not tonight. Tonight you just need to breathe." I looked at my father, a man I had not seen since I was 14 years old, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not relief. Not joy. Just the very first edge of something beginning. Raymond and I met 4 days later at a diner on West Park Drive. A booth by the window, 2 coffees, a basket of toast neither of us touched. He didn't open with an apology. I respected that. A man who leads with "I'm sorry" after a 20-year absence is a man performing contrition, not feeling it. Raymond set a manila folder on the table between us, smoothed it flat with one hand and said, "Before I explain why I've been gone, you need to see what I found. Because this affects you right now, and it can't wait." Inside that folder were 4 documents. The first was a property deed. A residential lot and small structure in Pearland, Texas, 0.8 acres. Assessed value $340,000, titled in my name. My legal name. Serena Adiz Okafor. My birth name, not my married name. I stared at it for a long time. Raymond explained carefully, in the measured voice of a man who had rehearsed this, that the property had belonged to my maternal grandmother, Grandma Cecilia, who had passed away in March of 2020. In her will, she had left it to me directly. Not to my mother, not to any other relative, specifically to me by name, with a handwritten addendum that Raymond read to me from a photocopied page. For Serena, who always sat with me the longest and asked the most questions. I want her to have something that's only hers. I had not been informed of this inheritance. I had not received any communication from an estate attorney. I had not been contacted by the executor of Grandma Cecilia's estate. I had received nothing. Not a letter, not a phone call, not a single word, about a $340,000 asset that was legally mine. The second document in the folder was a certified mail receipt, a letter from the estate attorney's office, addressed to me, delivered to the house I shared with Marcus in April of 2020. Signed for upon delivery. His signature. Marcus had signed for it. I set the paper down very slowly. Raymond watched me. He didn't rush. The third document was a copy of an email thread, obtained through a mutual contact I won't name here, between Marcus and a man named Glenn Harwell, a property manager, dated June 2020. In it, Marcus discussed a property matter recently resolved, and referenced having redirected documentation to avoid complications with the estate process. He had known. He had received that letter, understood what it was, and buried it. For 4 years he had been my husband while standing on top of a document that would have changed everything. The fourth document was a copy of Raymond's own correspondence with an estate attorney over the past 18 months, because Raymond, it turned out, had been quietly trying to find me. He had gone back to Grandma Cecilia's records after reconnecting with a cousin who mentioned the inheritance in passing. He had tracked the deed registry. He had found discrepancies in the estate closure. And when he couldn't reach me directly, because Marcus managed all the mail and most of the contact for our shared address, he had done something I still can barely process. He had attended events where Marcus's family was present. He had positioned himself carefully, patiently, waiting for a moment where he could reach me without going through my husband first. He had been in that dining room because it was the first time in 18 months that he had been able to get into the same physical space as me. He had been waiting for an opening. And Marcus, in his arrogance, in the absolute certainty that he was untouchable at his mother's dinner table, had given Raymond one. I sat in that diner booth for a long time after Raymond finished talking. Coffee went cold. The toast was still untouched. I thought about the $11,000 investment, the Thanksgiving dinner, the business loan cosign, the commercial property announcement, the guest in this family. I thought about 6 years of carefully constructed smallness. And then I thought about 0.8 acres in Pearland, Texas, and a handwritten note from a woman who had always seen me clearly. I looked at Raymond and asked him one question. Who is the best family law attorney in Houston? He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a business card on the table. I looked that up 3 weeks ago, he said. That was the moment everything shifted. I want to be very precise about what happened next because this is the part of the story that people most often get wrong when they imagine it. They imagine a confrontation. Raised voices, slammed doors, a dramatic declaration of war across a kitchen island. That's not what this was. That is never what this kind of thing is. Not when you do it correctly. What I did was quiet, methodical, and absolutely devastating in its patience. On Monday morning, 3 days after the diner meeting with Raymond, I called the attorney whose card he had given me. Her name was Deborah Anweli Sims. Family law, asset recovery, domestic abuse litigation. 15 years in practice. She had a corner office in Greenway Plaza and the specific kind of stillness that tells you immediately that this is a woman who has heard everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. I sat in her office for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I brought 3 things with me. The manila folder Raymond had given me, a flash drive, and a 4-page typed summary I had prepared the night before, organized chronologically with dates, amounts, and exact quotes where I could remember them. Deborah read my summary in silence, looked up once when she got to the certified mail receipt, and said, "He signed for this himself?" "His signature," I confirmed. She wrote something on her notepad and underlined it twice. The legal picture, as she laid it out over the following hour, was more comprehensive than I had expected. The intercepted inheritance document created a clear path for fraud and intentional concealment of marital assets, or in this case, premarital assets that had been deliberately hidden from their rightful owner. The property deed had never been transferred into Marcus's name. He had simply suppressed knowledge of its existence, which meant the asset was still legally and entirely mine. The estate could be reopened. The deed could be formally claimed. And given the documentation trail, there were grounds for additional financial claims within the divorce proceedings. Deborah said one more thing that I sat with for a long time afterward. She said, the fact that he never moved against the property itself, never tried to sell it or transfer it, suggests he intended to use it as leverage at some point. To offer it back to you as a concession during a divorce he was already planning on his terms. He had been planning an exit, while I was co-signing his loan. After leaving Deborah's office, I did not go home and act differently. This is the part one needs you to understand. I went home. I made dinner. I responded to Marcus's texts normally. I attended his cousin's birthday dinner that Friday and smiled and refilled my own glass and made small talk with Diane about a television show we both apparently watched. Inside, I opened a private personal checking account at a different bank from any account Marcus had access to, funded with my next 2 practice revenue deposits totaling $8,300. Over the following 19 days, I did the following things in this order. I contacted my accountant and had my business finances formally separated from any joint filing structure, documenting it as a standard business administrative reorganization, which it also genuinely was. I gathered and photographed 6 years of financial records, joint account statements, the loan cosign documents, the logistics investment transfer, tax filings, the certified mail receipt, and uploaded everything to a secured cloud folder that only Deborah and I had access to. I called my therapist, Dr. Marian Osei, who had been seeing me for 3 years. I told her everything. She was not surprised. She had been carefully, professionally not surprised for approximately 2.5 years, she told me gently, and she had documentation of her own session notes referencing incidents I had described over time, patterns I had named without fully naming, fears I had brought into that office and left half addressed. She offered to provide a clinical summary letter if it became relevant. It became relevant. I filed for divorce on a Thursday morning, 19 days after the dinner party. The filing included a formal petition for asset recovery, a request for a temporary restraining order citing the documented physical assault at the October dinner which, crucially, had occurred in front of 14 witnesses, none of whom had signed anything agreeing to stay silent, and a motion to formally establish ownership of the Pearland property. Deborah filed everything before noon. By 2 p.m., Marcus had been served. I was seeing a patient at my practice when it happened. I know the exact time because his assistant texted me. He's been served at 2:17 p.m., and I looked at my phone between sessions, read the message, set the phone face down on my desk, and walked back into the therapy room. I had 3 more patients that afternoon. I saw all 3 of them. I have been asked several times since that Thursday what it felt like to know the papers had been served. People expect me to say relief, or satisfaction, or something with more electricity to it, vindication, maybe, or the particular warmth of watching someone finally understand the consequences of their own choices. The truth is simpler and stranger than any of that. It felt like putting down something very heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. Marcus called me 11 minutes after being served. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again. By 4 p.m. he had called 7 times. By 6 p.m., 11. I listened to none of the messages that day. I drove home from my practice, stopped at the grocery store on Kirby, bought a rotisserie chicken and a container of pre-cut fruit, and ate dinner alone at my kitchen counter in complete, extraordinary silence. Patricia called the following morning at 7:43 a.m. I know the exact time because I was already awake, already dressed, already on my second cup of coffee when her name appeared on my screen. I did not answer. She called again at 8:01. Then Diane at 8:15, then a number I didn't recognize which turned out, Deborah informed me later, to be Patricia's personal attorney, who had apparently been contacted before most of Marcus's own family had finished breakfast. That told me everything about what Patricia had always understood this marriage to be by the end of that first week. The legal machinery was moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that I had spent 6 years applying to everything else in my life while Marcus's family treated me like a pleasant inconvenience. The temporary restraining order was granted. Marcus was required to vacate the shared residence within 72 hours. He left with 2 suitcases and his car. He did not take the rosemary focaccia plates, he did not take the ivory napkins, which were Patricia's anyway and had never belonged in our home to begin with. The Pearland property took 6 weeks to formally establish through the reopened estate process, but the outcome was never in doubt once the certified mail receipt entered the record. Deborah described the opposing counsel's position toward the end of that process as increasingly difficult to maintain with a straight face. The deed was transferred into my name, clear and uncontested, on a Wednesday afternoon in December, assessed value at closing. $347,000, slightly higher than Raymond's folder had shown, because property values in that corridor had continued to climb. The financial recovery within the divorce proceedings was more complex, but the loan co-sign documentation. proved especially useful. $60,000 in SBA loan liability that bore my credit signature. For a business that had generated revenue Marcus had never shared with me. Deborah argued successfully for compensatory consideration. I will not share the final settlement figure in full, because some of that is still under agreed terms. What I will say is that I walked out of that marriage with more financial security than I had walked into it, which is not something many people who have been systematically financially controlled can say. And I do not say it lightly. Marcus never apologized. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a moment of reckoning from the person who hurt you, a phone call, a letter, some gesture toward accountability. It didn't come. What came instead was a series of increasingly desperate legal maneuvers from his side that Deborah handled with the calm efficiency of someone swatting away slow flies. T1 point. His attorney argued that my co-signature on the business loan had been a gift of support freely given. Deborah's response to that, in writing, was 4 pages long and surgically precise. I read it twice and both times felt something close to joy. Patricia issued a statement to the family, not publicly, that I was told about secondhand through a cousin of Marcus's who had sat at that October dinner table and had, in the weeks following, reached out to me quietly with an apology. Patricia's statement characterized the divorce as Serena's decision and expressed hope that the family could move forward with Grace. I found this interesting, given that Grace had been notably absent from the room when I needed it most. The 14 witnesses to the October incident were never asked to testify formally. They didn't need to be. The restraining order had already been granted on other grounds, and Deborah had structured the case so that the dinner party served as context rather than cornerstone. But those 14 people knew what they had seen and they knew what they had not done. I think some of them will carry that knowledge for a long time. I genuinely hope they do. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for sitting with it. Stories like this one don't always get told, because the people living them are often too exhausted, or too ashamed, or too afraid that no one will believe them. So if any part of what Serena experienced felt familiar, the quiet erasure, the smile you held through something you should never have had to hold a smile through, the moment you realized someone had been keeping something from you that was always yours, I want you to know that recognition is not an accident. You are not imagining it. And you are not without options. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if there is one thing in your life right now that you have been tolerating instead of addressing, one door you've been afraid to walk through, I hope something in this story gives you the quiet courage to take the first step. Not the loudest step, just the first one. Like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I'll see you in the next one.